Good morning. Today we're going to look at 2 Samuel 6 through 8. In chapter 6, it details David taking 30,000 soldiers, it says, and they set out to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And it's been in this city for quite some time where it was in Judah, and Judah is David had been ruling for quite some time, and then now with being king of Israel as well, the combined nation, the north and south, David has begun to make his home, his palace in Jerusalem, his headquarters. So Jerusalem was the military and economic capital, and that way, and so David figured it's time to make it also the religious leaders' place, a religious center. And so they go and they start to bring this ark. And you remember, as the Israelites were moving through the wilderness, in the 40 years of wandering, the ark was to be carried, on poles that were out, and to be carried, kind of on the shoulders of the bearers. But here it's changed evidently, because they're hauling the Ark of the Covenant on a new cart, it says in verse 3, and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on a hill. And then it talks two men, Uzzah and Ahio, the sons were driving this new cart with the Ark of God. And as they were going, it says they were all dancing before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines. And so they had all of the people that were there. I mean, they were rejoicing and celebrating as the ark was being moved. It, in a way, it reminds me of the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. These people were excited to be bringing the Ark of God, that held the tablets of the Ten Commandments and the jar of manna, and that this was the presence of God. And as they were going along, it was on the hill, and it says the oxen shook it, the bumpy road or whatever. But one of the people, Uzzah, reached out his hand and he touched the Ark of the Covenant, and he was struck dead. And evidently God struck him dead, because you weren't supposed to touch it. Well, how could you move it that way? But anyway, and it says that David's anger was David was angry with the Lord because Uzzah had died that way, and then a little bit fearful, a little bit of trepidation there came into him. Maybe we shouldn't bring it to Jerusalem yet, So they put it in the home of another person there, and it says it was there for 3 months in the house of Obed-Edom, and it says that his household all prospered, and everything, the blessings of having the ark in his home were very evident. And this was reported to David. So then David, and verse 15, David and all the house of Israel brought the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of trumpet. Again, celebrating that they were bringing the ark to Jerusalem, and dancing with joy to the Lord. And when they got there, then they were dancing and celebrating, and David's wife, Michal, whichever, Saul's daughter, saw David dancing and thought, well, he's making a spectacle of himself. And she kind of looked down her nose at him then. And when David found that out, she said to him, how the king of Israel dishonored himself, uncovering himself before the eyes of the maids as a vulgar fellow with a shamelessly presented himself. And then we read that, she died childless, and whether that was a punishment, because of that or whatever. But David and all of these were dancing with joy and celebrating to the Lord. And David made an offering to God then when when it was done, and so I mean, it was always the priests that had to do the offering, but here David makes a burnt offering, a sacrifice to God, as the Ark of the Covenant is brought in and set in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. It says in verse 17. And there was we've seen the word house, like in verse 15. So David and all the house of Israel, brought the ark up. In chapter 7, when the king was settled in his house, well, the king would most likely live in more of a palace. So the king was settled in his house, and then he decides that he should build a house for the Ark of the Covenant, and this house would be a temple. And God says, "Who are you that you think you're going to build this temple for me? I can't be contained." He was, as the whole time that the Israelites were in the wilderness, he was, the ark was there, and he lived in the tabernacle, the tent that they would pitch and move, but God says, through the prophet Nathan, and here we're introduced to Nathan, and he comes into prominent play again later, but the Lord came to Nathan when David was intending to build this temple, and the Lord tells Nathan to go and tell David, are you the one to build a house to live, for me to live in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought out the people of Israel from Egypt, but I've been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. And so David is told not to build the house. But within that, he's told through this that his house, his house will be a continual blessing for the people of Israel. And verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will write, verse 11, the Lord will make you a house. When the days are fulfilled, I will bring up. And so this time the word house is meaning a dynasty. This family that's going to be ruling and in place for a long time. And it's interesting how many different meanings this word house can have, and we're not really quite done with different meanings for that word of house yet either. But God promises David in this chapter that there will be sons and grandsons and ruling after him. The kingdom of David, the dynasty of David, doesn't last forever, because somewhere 575, 600 BC, somewhere in there, the Israelites are again defeated and everything that way. But God has told David that he will make this dynasty of him. And verse 18, David went in and sat before the Lord and said, who am I and what is my house that you have brought me this far? Who are my people? My house, my family. This is, so just kind of one more illustration of how to use that word house, or how it's meant. He's not talking about his palace. He's not really talking about a temple. He's not talking about all of his offspring, the descendants and everything that way. But who am I, this physical person? Who am I that you have brought me thus far? And I was a small thing in your eyes, and sometimes we wonder, well, who am I in the midst of this whole great big universe? Who am I? Who are we, human beings, that God would care so much for us? We are his creation, his very good creation, created in his own image that way. And so, God has assured David of of his offspring that will continue to rule, and that one of his offspring will then be the one who will build the temple for the Lord in the city of Jerusalem. So as we've looked at this chapter, it's the the ark has been brought to Jerusalem, and God talks to David about who he is and how his offspring will continue to rule. Chapter 8, David continues, the battles against different nations, different peoples, and is successful against them. In verse 9, it says, when King Toi of Hamath heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadazer, he sent his son to greet him and congratulate him. So there's one king that is at peace with David. There's one, David doesn't war with this king or try to gain control of his lands. But so, the Israelites aren't at war with everybody. But there's one of the nearby kings, they live together in peace and harmony and work together that way. So in chapter 8, verse 15, David reigned over all of Israel, and he administered justice and equity to all his people, and that's so important, to administer justice and peace and equity to all the people, to treat everybody the same. And that's what God does. He doesn't show any favoritism. He doesn't look at me as any better than you, or you as any better than me, or anybody else. And that's a hard lesson for a lot of people to realize that, in the eyes of God, we are all the same, sinners that he has redeemed through his son, Jesus Christ.